Thank you all for joining. Today we are going to, between Neo and I, we are going to talk about strategies on how to raise successful SBIR, STTR startups to grants to fund your startup. Um, so, a little about us. We are Capamet Consulting is a boutique innovation management consulting firm. We work with tech and biomedical startups with product and commercialization strategies. We often partner with founders, startups, and organizations that work with startups, either as consultants, advisors, or fractional executives to help them get to their next milestone by helping them develop a business plan, a commercialization strategy, product market fit, help with fundraising, as well as developing strategic partnerships. Basically, we believe in up our sleeves and being a part of the organization and the startup that we are working with. So, a little about me. I'm Famida Kapadia. I'm the founder and president of Capamet Consulting. I'm also an entrepreneur in residence at BW Tech at UMBC. Big shout out to BW Tech at UMBC for being a collaborator on this event with us. Um, Over the last 15 years, I've worked with and supported over 100 entrepreneurial projects to build and scale. I also serve as a mentor for the Maryland Tech Council Venture Mentoring Services. I'm the co-vice chair of memberships for the Women in Bio Capital region. And I am a 2019 Fulbright Scholar to Brazil, where I taught entrepreneurship and design thinking. I would like to now introduce my partner and colleague, Neo Gamo, who will go ahead and get us started off with the webinar.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Neo Gamo, and I'm the founder and CEO of NeoCorp LLC. We are a grant consulting company where we work with entrepreneurs, researchers, and clinicians to win grant funding for biotech and medtech startups. So I draw my experience as both a grant recipient and reviewer, and I've worked with almost 20 clients on almost 100 grant proposals over the last several years. I also have a couple of roles supporting the development of new ventures. I'm the VP of Business Development at the MDC Studio, which is a startup studio building health and medtech companies from very early stages. And I am also an associate at the Verte Family of Funds, which is a group of venture funds investing in early stage tech companies in opportunity zones throughout the country. In my previous life, I was actually an academic researcher in neuroscience. So I got my PhD in neurobiology at Yale University, and I was a postdoc in the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins. I'm also the former founder and CEO of Neurosonics Medical, where we're developing a therapeutic ultrasound device to make brain surgery a lot less invasive, and through which I raised over $500,000 in grant funding. So now I'm going to move on to winning SBIR and STTR funding to jumpstart your startup. So first, I'm going to describe what SBIRs and STTRs are. The SBIR stands for Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR stands for Small Business Technology Transfer. These are often called America's Seed Fund, and these are research grants for small businesses in the U.S. available from 12 government agencies. So government agencies including the NIH, National Institutes of Health, NSF, National Science Foundation, also Department of Defense, FDA, NASA, Department of Education, and so on. And of these, the Department of Defense and the Health and Human Services, which includes the NIH, get the biggest shares of the pie. So I mentioned that these are research grants. So these are for technologies that still require some research and development to overcome risks and challenges until they can be commercialized as a product. So for example, the NSF tends to like projects where you're trying to demonstrate the feasibility of a core technology. There are also several different phases of the SBIR and STTR. Obviously, phase one comes first. Right now, it's around $250,000 to $300,000, depending on the agency. And the goal is to show feasibility, technical merit, and commercial potential of an innovation. So for example, you may be trying to create a proof of concept prototype that shows that the technology will work as intended and to be of commercial value to customers. or you may be trying to show that a technology will work to solve a clinical problem in a new and better way. Phase 1 is followed by phase 2, which is currently around $1 million to $2 million, again, depending on the agency. And the goal is to continue the R&D from phase 1, further develop the product, and prepare to attract additional funding. So for example, you may want to do a full-scale development and evaluation of a product. I want to point out that once you're applying for phase 2, you may need to prepare a pretty extensive commercialization plan for your proposal. There are a couple of other options. Fast track is when you apply for phase 1 and 2 at the same time. So a lot of work up front, but a lot easier later on. And direct to phase 2 is where you feel you've already shown the feasibility of your technology, and if you don't feel that you need to go through phase 1. I do want to note that fast track and direct to phase 2 are not always available. It just depends on the year. So you may be wondering what the differences are between SBIR and STTR. So the SBIR program was created first to stimulate tech innovation and evaluate commercial potential among small businesses. And then the STTR was created later on to encourage R&D collaborations between small businesses and research institutions. So in practical terms, the differences are mostly administrative. The main thing is that with an SBIR, you can't partner with a research institution, whereas with an STTR, you have to partner with a research institution. The way the budget is distributed between the small business and elsewhere is also different. So for an SBIR, up to a third of the budget can go outside of the company, whereas with an STTR, you'll get more flexibility in distributing the budget outside of the company. So at least 40% has to go to the company, at least 30% has to go to this research institution, and the remaining 30% can go to either the company or elsewhere. Another thing is that for the SBIR, the PI has to be 51% employed by the company. No one's actually checking to see if you're working 51% of the time for your company. What that essentially means is that the PI cannot be employed elsewhere full-time for the duration of the project. Whereas with an STTR, the PI may be employed by the company or the partnering research institution. So a lot of people have heard of the SBIR and maybe not necessarily STTR, but I do encourage you to consider the STTR. Depending on the government agency, the success rate can be higher than for the SBIR. It can also look good for a new small business to have a partnership with an established research institution. And from the university side, it can be prestigious for the university person to be the PI rather than just a subcontractor. All right. So there are some pros and cons with the SBIR and STTR programs. So big pro is that this is as I mentioned, this is a grant or non-dilutive funding, which means that you don't need to give up equity or control of your company in order to accept the money. So this is good, not just for founders, but also for your investors. There are also many opportunities available for early stage projects and ventures that may be considered too early for investment funding. If you can get it, there are many millions of dollars available. It's also very prestigious to get one of these awards. It certainly adds credibility to your company, which can help with follow-on funding and even company valuation. And you can also get pretty detailed feedback when you apply, which I think on its own is pretty worthwhile. However, there are some cons. So these awards take a lot of effort and time to apply for. They're also very competitive. And even if you do get it, it can take at least 6 months for you to get the money in your bank account. So this is a pretty slow process. So you may not want to rely completely on grant funding for your company. There can be restrictions on how you can use the money. And if you're from the academic world, this will sound familiar. The feedback doesn't always make sense, may conflict with each other, but you still have to be able to respond. All right, so there are several things you should check before you apply. So first, you want to make sure you're eligible. The government has a specific definition of a small business. So the company has to be for profit. It has to be US owned or controlled, which means that it should be over 50% directly owned or controlled by one or more US citizens or permanent residents. And your company should have less than 500 people. And the work has to be performed in the US unless you have a very good reason for not doing so. You want to make sure that your project fits with the funding agency and opportunity. So here, I highly recommend talking to a person from funding agency, usually called the program manager or the program officer for the SBIR and STTR for that particular funding agency. They'll be able to tell you what the priorities are of the funding organization and of the funding opportunity. Because, for example, funding priorities for an agency can change year to year, and it's not always obvious from reading the instructions or looking at the websites. You can also check recently funded projects to see if there are similar things, similar projects to yours. You also want to check the amount and duration of funding, make sure that fits with what you want to do and the priorities of your business. Of course, you want to check the deadline. I want to point out that some opportunities require a letter of intent or a project pitch before you can submit a full proposal. And sometimes there are different deadlines for new proposals as opposed to resubmissions. You want to also check the expected start date of the award, which would indicate when the money is likely to come in. And as I mentioned, this is pretty slow and can take several months. I like to check the approximate effort required for the application. So I look into, how many pages you need to write, what kind of information you need. Some proposals will require a more extensive commercialization plan than others. In general, the more money you're asking for, the more effort that's required. And finally, check if there are any other special requirements. For example, there may be limits on the equipment budget, or you may or may not be allowed to propose a clinical trial. So once you've decided to apply, the overall goal of your grant proposal is to convince the reviewers that you know what you're doing and that you can do the project. So you want to talk about the who, what, where, when, and why. So that can include your skill set, your experience, relevant track record, if you have the right collaborative partners, access to the necessary resources, and so on. And you want to make sure that the scope of your project and your budget are realistic. So basically, the reviewers should be able to easily explain why you should get funded. And remember, the reviewers may or may not have expertise in your area. Again, like I mentioned, the program manager or the program officer is your friend while you're preparing your proposal. They can answer any questions you have. It can also let you know whether your project is of interest to the funding agency. The next issue is a big one. You have to follow the instructions exactly, because if you don't, that can be reasons for rejection without review. So I like to check for updated instructions every single time I apply. So you want to carefully read the solicitation or request for application or RFA. So for example, if they tell you to use a certain font, format, or file name, they're not kidding. I do want to point out, don't try to get away with a slightly smaller font or margin because that can be considered cheating. Also, when reviewers are looking at a whole bunch of proposals, it's really obvious if you're the only one using a slightly smaller font. Similarly, don't submit extra information that they don't ask for. So in this case, more is not better. So don't put in extra information and don't put in hyperlinks if they're not allowed, because again, these can be reasons for rejection without review. And you also want to tailor your proposal carefully to the funding opportunity and the funding organization. So it's usually a good idea to try to incorporate phrases from the instructions into your proposal. And finally, start early. So the first thing you're going to do, you're going to have to register your company on various company websites. The first one you'll probably do is called the SAM registration, which stands for System for Award Management. And this one can take 2 to 8 weeks for the initial registration and 4 to 6 weeks every time you renew it online. It actually does take that long, and there's nothing you can do about it. So make sure to start at least 2 months in advance. Great. So next, we're going to talk about a couple of common components in the SBIR and STTR proposals. So first, I'll talk about the section called the project description or research strategy. So this is really the meat of the proposal, and it's where you're going to describe what you're proposing to do with the money. So I suggest starting with this section because all the other sections are going to follow from what you describe here. So here you want to tell a compelling story. You want to make sure you understand the literature and the background research related to your project and any key questions or gaps or controversies in the field. And you should be able to explain how your project fits in. You want to be very specific about your plans and deliverables. So reviewers like to see quantitative metrics so that it's very clear if you've succeeded or failed in meeting certain milestones. Preliminary data are often appreciated and important. And even if the instructions say you don't need preliminary data, you're probably competing against proposals that have preliminary data or at least some background research. If there are any weaknesses or pitfalls, you want to address them directly because the reviewers will notice. And finally, you try to use a lot of graphics like charts, graphs, tables, and pictures to make things as clear as possible and easy to understand, especially for reviewers who are not experts in your field. So now I'm going to hand it off to Famita, who's going to talk about the commercialization strategy.
Thanks, Neil. So, with respect to the commercialization strategy, depending upon what organization you're applying to, they'll have different requirements around the extent of commercialization plan that they want in the proposal. So, if you're applying for a phase one, for example, NIH requires a half a page of commercialization strategy, whereas NSF requires 3 pages. So make sure that you are familiar with what is the effort required on commercialization strategy, depending upon the agency that you're applying to. I'd like to highlight the difference between phase one and phase two. So this is language directly from the NSF RFP. In phase one, they want you to determine whether your innovation has sufficient intellectual merit and broader commercial impact, which means all that they're looking for in phase one is to help you get to proof of concept. They know you have a technology, they know you have some research data that shows that it works in the lab, and they want you to propose experiments that will get you to the proof of concept. At this stage, they understand that you're pretty early stage in your development process, and you probably don't have a lot of work done around your commercialization strategy, which is why the requirement is much lower. But when you look at phase two, the goal of phase two is to advance your technology aggressively towards commercial deployment. So in this phase, they're actually looking for you to move your technology towards a commercializable product, right? At this phase, you should have a pretty strong understanding of what you're going to do with the product, how are you going to get it to market, and what is your strategy going to be. And so the requirement for commercialization strategy is pretty high, 12 to 15 pages, depending upon which agency you're applying to. So I would characterize the elements of a commercialization plan under 4 main headings. What is your market opportunity? What is your value proposition? What is your revenue and business model? And who is your team and company? And I'll talk about each of these in detail. So with market opportunity, you want to understand and address the market needs. So many of you might have done customer discovery work early on, whether it was as part of your research project, if you've gone through an I-Core program, you might have done customer discovery, and you might have some information around who is your customer, what is their unmet need, how are they currently solving it. This part is critical for you to understand in order for you to understand the market need. Then comes the part of what is the urgency of your solution. So in your customer discovery, when you're talking to your customers, it's very easy to understand the urgency of solution. If you had a conversation where they said, oh, that's really cool, that's very interesting, and then there was no follow-up after that, probably the urgency is not very high. But if the response you're getting is, oh, when are you getting to market? Is this available to buy? When can I get it? The customer is telling you, please build this for us. I really want to buy it. And that should be your target customer. We talk about beachhead markets, right? Beachhead market is effectively who is your first customer that you're going to go to market with. And that is the response that you want in order to identify who your target customer market is going to be. And then you also want to outline how does your product solve the pain. Next, you want to talk about the size of the market. So, how big is the market? You want to talk about your TAM, SAM, and SOM. TAM being your total addressable market, SAM being your serviceable available market, and SOM being your serviceable obtainable market. So, TAM, to put it very simply, is the numbers that you might pull out of a market research report. Often, a market research report will tell you what the TAM market is. So, as an example, let's say that you're developing a predictive analytics software for healthcare. You pull a BCC market research report or markets and markets research report, and they tell you that the TAM is about $10 billion. That is the total market for healthcare predictive analytics. Now you have to determine what is your serviceable addressable market. So the product that you're developing is not going to be able to do predictive analytics for everything in the healthcare industry. Maybe the product that you're developing is designed to do predictive analytics for cardiovascular disease. That becomes your serviceable addressable market. And then your SOM is what percent of that serviceable addressable market will you be able to capture? So unless you're a monopoly, you're not going to be able to capture 100% of your market. So realistically, think about what percent of that market can you actually capture, and that becomes your SOM. It's very important to identify your niche, right? It's very easy to say my customer is everybody who, if you're developing a cell phone, say, for example, this was a standing joke early on. I'm going to the Chinese market and there are a billion people in China and I'm going to sell cell phones. So my market is a billion people. That is not the right way to think about your market. You really need to identify who will actually buy your product and why will they buy your product. You also want to look at, is the market growing and what are the trends? You want to enter a market that is showing you a decent year-over-year growth so that you know that your business has survivability and sustainability in the long run. You want to talk about your commercialization strategy, as in what is your go-to-market strategy and how will you reach your customers? And then most importantly, what is your product and service, which you would have started talking about in your research, but now start linking your product and service to the actual market. And then how will the funding help you get to the next milestone by the end of the grant? Next piece you want to talk about is the value proposition. So this is talking about why will someone buy from you? So there are 4 pieces that you have to look into for the value proposition. What is your competition? Doesn't matter what product you're taking to market, you're always going to have competition. Even if there isn't an existing product in the market, people have figured out a way to solve their problem. And that then becomes your competition. So you need to understand the competitive landscape as well as the strengths and weaknesses of the competition. Then you want to address what is the customer satisfaction with the existing products. Are they satisfied with the solutions? What are the gaps in the solutions? So the gaps in the solutions could be, well, you have a product. It works really well, but it's really expensive. And so most people cannot afford it. That then becomes a gap because if it is not affordable, it's not accessible to a lot of people. And can your product help fill that gap? You want to talk about how your product is addressing the need or the gap in the market. How is it better, cheaper, faster than the competition? And if you're working on a tech or a biomedical product, what is your IP landscape? And then lastly, you want to talk about your adoption strategy, as in why will the customer buy for you? from you. So in the adoption strategy, you also want to think about what are the barriers to entry. So even if you have a really good product that addresses a need, you really have to think about the barriers to entry. So for example, if there is a lot of infrastructure required to put to place in order for your product adoption, that is a barrier to entry. On the flip side, maybe the customer is using a product and they have put a lot of infrastructure in place. And so if they have to switch from their existing product to your product, they will have to redesign their system or rearrange things, and that could then become a barrier to entry. So you have to think about those things, you have to address this, and then more importantly, you also have to address how are you going to solve for these problems that you are potentially going to experience as you're going to market. You want to talk about your company and your team. So talk about the basics of your company, like when was your company established, what is the structure of the company, etc. The core competencies of the company, as well as if you've had any revenue till date, this would be a good spot to talk about it. And then you want to talk about your team. Why are you the right team to take this product to market? Really think about talk about your experiences and what advantages do you bring to the table as you're developing this product and trying to take it to market. Also, don't be shy to talk about your weaknesses. So weaknesses, for example, would be, hey, we have a really great CEO and a CSO on board, but we need to bring on either a regulatory consultant or a CFO or something like that. It's really great to be able to identify the gaps in your team, and then also propose how are you going to solve for it. There might also be opportunities to actually put that gap as a budget line item in your grant proposal. And then lastly, you want to talk about your revenue and business model. So talk about what are your needs, how much money do you need for your project from the SBIR grant, and how will this move your technology forward. Know that many funding agencies will allow you to budget about $50,000 for commercialization services. And if you're early stage, this is a good opportunity for you to earmark some funds so that you can bring on some talent and expertise to help you with your commercialization strategy development. You also want to talk about existing partnerships, any leads that you might have, any agreements that you might have in place. So you're familiar with doing this probably with the research side of things, right? We collaborate on the research side of things all the time, and we put in the letters of support. The same model goes in the commercialization strategy as well. So for example, maybe you have a customer that you have been having ongoing conversations with, and they're very interested in your product. This would be a great place to drop a letter of support from them saying, if you build it, we will buy it. These letters go a long way towards providing commercialization credibility for your product. You also want to talk about your go-to-market strategy, your pricing strategy, and your reimbursement strategy. So if you are a direct-to-consumer product, your reimbursement strategy is pretty straightforward. You need to know what your pricing is, and you're going to sell the product, and the customer is going to pay for it. But if you are in the healthcare field, there is a significant amount of work that needs to be done to identify your commercialization strategy, identify what codes you're going to use, if it is going to be a bundled payment, if this is going to be part of value-based care payment, etc. So you need to explain how you're going to get paid and how much you're going to get paid. SBIR also wants you to put together a 3-year pro forma. So the 3-year pro forma is from the time the grant ends. So let's say I won the SBIR today, my grant is valid for a year. So I need to put together a pro forma from 2025 to 2028. And these would be projections of what is going to happen in the next 3 years with respect to my company. If you are a tech product, maybe you'll end up getting your product to market in the next 3 years. If you're a biomedical product, you're probably still going to be in product development in the next 3 years, but you will get additional funding in, and the funding then gets reported as revenue if you're not in market yet, and you list both your revenue and your expenses in your pro forma. Next, please. So I just want to emphasize that the NSF is really strong on the commercialization plan. So if you're especially looking at an NSF SBIR, make sure that you have a strong commercialization strategy, because NSF will, the depth and quality of the commercialization plan is a very critical element for the NSF review. Now I'll turn it back to Neil to talk about the final stages of review and submission.
Thank you, Famita. So you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with the review criteria, which should be described in the instructions, because these highlight what's important in the proposal. I do want to get across that it really doesn't matter how you interpret the instructions. You need to understand what the reviewers expect to see. So follow the review criteria closely. I recommend using it like a checklist that the reviewers are trying to check off while they go through a proposal. And you want to make it easy for them to say yes. And again, I want to remind you that your proposal is probably being compared to all the others in a review panel. So it's going to be pretty obvious if you're the only one doing something a little different. I do want to dedicate a slide to the submission part of your grant proposal, because this part is actually not trivial if you've never done it before. So different funding agencies will have different submission procedures. So most likely you're going to be setting up a submission portal online. So for example, with the NIH, you'll deal with ERA Commons, and then for the NSF, you go to research.gov. Again, I cannot emphasize enough to start early, especially if you're doing this for the first time, because there is a learning curve. I do want to point out that, for example, for the NIH, you need to register your company on ERA Commons, and that can take a couple of weeks. So this does take time. And then once you've started to set everything up, I would allow at least 1 day to upload and check everything, because you're going to be entering a lot of info and you're probably dealing with last minute error messages. So I suggest clearing your day, because this tends to take longer than you think. It can also get a little complicated. For example, different people with different login credentials may need to approve the submission before it's finally submitted. If you're working with a research institution, you're probably going to deal with extra paperwork, and there's often an internal deadline for the research institution before the actual deadline. So you want to make sure you're aware of that. And then finally, download and check the PDF submission file if you can, because that's probably what the reviewer is going to see. So you want to make sure that it looks okay and that nothing is corrupted. There are some things you can do after you submit. So if you're rejected, don't worry. It's pretty rare to get a grant the first time you apply. So the first one tends to be difficult. You just have to keep trying. But make sure to get feedback. I think the feedback often is very worthwhile on its own. And if you like to resubmit, check the rules. Check when the deadline is and how many times you can submit. If you're accepted, that's amazing. But it's only getting started. So check the compliance guidelines. Depending on the funding agency, there's going to be rules about record keeping, how to handle any changes to the proposed project or budget. There's going to be reporting requirements, and you may be required to attend certain conferences or workshops. I do want to point out, if you misuse SBIR funds, that is very serious and can result in prison time or hefty fines. It does happen. Some years ago, somebody used SBIR funding to buy a car, go on vacation, and so on. That person got 3 years in federal prison for wire fraud and had to forfeit almost $1.5 million, just FYI. So see this as an opportunity to build a good track record for your company, because that's going to help you a lot with follow-on funding. So last slide, I want to go over some additional tips and resources. Mock reviews, I think are very, very helpful when you're preparing your proposal. These proposals are often reviewed by business and technical experts. So see if you can find such people or people who have experience with specific funding agencies. Famita and I actually offer this as a service. So feel free to reach out to us. We'll be very happy to help. You probably also noticed that there are several unspoken rules when it comes to preparing SBIR and STTR proposals that are not obvious in the instructions or the websites. So again, really good idea to get feedback from the program or program manager or program officer, and also talk to people who've applied. You can also see if you can get access to some successful examples of proposals. I know that, for example, the National Institute of Aging has some sample applications up on their website. So make sure to check those out. They tend to be pretty helpful. So SBIR and STTR is just one source of money for your company. But as I mentioned, it is a slow process. So I think personally, I would recommend that it should not be your only source of funding. So look into other non-dilutive funding and investment funding in parallel. I want to point out that if you do your phase 1 project, apply for phase 2, and then get your and then start phase 2 project, there's going to be a funding gap between when you finish your phase 1 and when you can start phase 2. So just be aware and prepared for that. If you don't want to have that funding gap, you can apply for a fast track option, which means that you apply for phase 1 and 2 at the same time. So there are several other resources available. You can Google and often find free resources from organizations like BioHealth Innovation, TEDCO, NIH, Small Business Administration. I've used a lot of these resources, so I'll be happy to share any experiences. But if you'd like more one-on-one guidance, you may want to consider working with a grant consultant. So I often help, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, researchers, and clinicians to help them navigate the whole process. And so we can, Famita and I have done this many, many times. We can help with writing the whole proposal if you need. We can just help with the administrative aspects or the submission, or even if you just need a second look at your proposal to get some review or feedback. So feel free to reach out to us. Famita and I both do offer a free 30-minute consultation, so we'll be happy to meet you. Finally, Famita and I have prepared a free SBIR and STTR cheat sheet. So look out for a follow-up email after the webinar so that we can send it to you. And I also want to give a heads up that we are working on SBIR and STTR boot camps and writing groups where we can hand out more extensive plug-and-play guides and templates starting this summer in time for the next set of deadlines. So thank you, everyone, and we will be happy to take any questions.